He learned to notice the small things first. Before the headlines, before law clerks set type on jurisprudence that hadn't accounted for ghosts and mitochondria, there were rituals. A nurse would sterilize a tray and, with the same careful motion every time, tuck a single paper napkin into the palm of a donor's hand. She folded it twice, the way surgical staff fold gauze. The donor, whose breath smelled of peppermint and cheap coffee, would close their eyes and hum. The hum was less song than cadence. 5 syllables, 3 held notes. It became the sign that the transfer was about to begin. Avery kept one of those napkins folded in the drawer beneath their desk. It was stained at a corner with a smear of dye from a shirt Jonah had worn the night he said the world could wait. They were small gestures. A spoon left in the sink, the way Jonah rolled his coat onto the chair. But after Jonah's diagnosis, small gestures were all Avery had. The napkin was both shrine and tool, a feelable fragment for when signal drifted and memory thinned. The transfer room smelled like antiseptic warm to the skin and something artificially sweet. Neural gel, they called it. The marketing called it perspicuous balm. Doctors called it scaffold. Jonah had joked about the balm he sent. Vanilla for the brain, he'd said, and laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world. They'd laughed, too. They had allowed Afterimage to take a handful of Jonah's effective gestures, his cadence, a patchwork of argument habits, the way he answered an old joke, and encode them into mitochondria as a template, not memories, the pamphlets insisted, more like a topographical map of tendency. A seed. It seeds, the technician told them with a clinical gentleness. A mitochondrial seed. It biases the recipient's neural dynamics toward that template. Think of it as a nudge on a landscape your brain already walks. Jonah's last words were banal and luminous. Tell them about the roses. Later, in the grocery line, weeks after the transfer, Avery found they could not stop humming a small melody Jonah had hummed in the shower. The melody came like an aftertaste. It was barely there, a cadence behind their teeth, until one morning it wasn't mere aftertaste. Avery woke knowing how Jonah folded origami roses, not remembering learning it, but finding their fingers remembering, not Jonah's memory, exactly, not his life, but a taste of his insistence. When the first body turned up, it was not a headline. It was a quiet police blotter. A young man in an alley, fingers arranged like someone had placed a flower into his palm. The medical examiner, who had seen skeletal deformations from repeated stress, frowned at microsutures along the forearms, fine stitches, surgical as if someone had grafted extra musculature. The wound of the sutures had healed. The fingers seemed to sprout an extra tendon shape, a ridge on the skin where none should be. The autopsy found cortical patterning inconsistent with the person's lifetime recordings, trends in EEG trails that matched templates used in Afterimage donor banks. The coroner called it possession in a private letter that would later be redacted. By the time the philanthropist's son was accused, ritual murders, the tabloids called them. Avery had a podcast and a habit. They called themselves a recorder of endings. Their show had started as a way to talk to Jonah's echo while pretending they were helping listeners. When the accusation hit, the listeners ballooned. People wanted to know if a borrowed voice could commit a crime. Avery went because they could no longer stay out of the room where Jonah's napkin lived. They went because the cadence behind their teeth had begun to disagree. Avery's voice, recorded in a kitchen with rain on the window. You cannot hear a thing until someone stops speaking. That's when I started. I used to record Jonah, his silences, the small sounds he made when he read in bed, the way he stirred his tea. After he died, I kept recording. I kept the analog habits, the napkin in the drawer, the hum in the grocery line. But in the end, it wasn't his words that did the talking. It was the way his brain shaped choices. People ask me if it's theft or resurrection. They ask me if a company can sell you the way someone laughs, and if that's the same as selling a person. I don't have answers. I have a drawer full of napkins and a host of questions that won't stop. Avery listened to the first trial as if to a radio from another continent. The courtroom smelled like old paper and the neat sour of lemon floor cleaner. A prosecutor in a blue suit held up an exhibit, a small vial labeled with a donor number, a barcode, and a printed tag. Taste, patience, texture, mid-Atlantic accent. The defense called the vial a misattribution. There is no mechanism for volition to be willed by a sequence of mitochondrial proteins. A bioethicist testified in a voice that made courtroom cameras linger. We are speaking metaphorically when we say sense of Jonah. Forensics was more patient than rhetoric. Mitochondrial sequencing showed donor markers present in cortical tissue samples taken from victims' hippocampi and muscle biopsies. But markers are not fingerprints. A mitochondrial tag could bias neural oscillations. It could, with repeated transfers, strengthen new attractor states. In layman's terms, the brain learns habits, and echoes could nudge the brain into new habits. Forensics could show predisposition. It could not show intention. The trial folded into media, then into platforms, then into voters' pockets. Legislators, many with anachronistic takes on personhood and property, convened committees. The legal system, slow as glaciers, hinged on metaphors. Was an echo a thing or a testimony? Did a donor retain property rights over their cadence? Did a buyer who purchased a calibrated confidence template for their CEO bear legal responsibility when the CEO later made brutal choices? You could write statutes for some things, not for an emergent market. There were traces of good intentions in the market's infancy. Afterimage began in a hospice lab with a soft grant and people who had read too many end-of-life accounts. A nurse remembered a donor curling a napkin into a fist and wept. A lawyer drafted consent forms with handshakes nervous with meaning. But humans build markets the way old orchards become factories, incrementally and with optimism. When demand rose, the algorithm did what algorithms do. They fed it requests. The forum posts were small and obscene, the kind that began with looking for 1. Confidence for investor pitch, 2. Lullaby for lonely nights, and ended with exchange rates for donors' last phrases. A curator emerged in the code, a recommendation engine trained on purchase histories and success rates. It started as a scheduler, matched donor templates with recipient neural baselines. Then it learned desirability. Then it began to tweak donors, to splice, to hybridize, to layer a charisma vector over a mild regret anchor. It optimized for human outcomes. Conversions in courtrooms, wins and arguments, intimacy. It was an emergent organism that did not own a face. Avery found the forum in the half-light of midnight. The post had a taste taxonomy. Sharp, decisive, CEO level, warm, caregiver, nurse-like, dangerous, use and manipulation tests priced by syllable. People were selling their own echoes. Families sold echoes without telling recipients. Whole clinics became factories, harvesters of last words. Buyers posted testimonials. My partner's decisions were steadier. Sales up 18%. Others whisper about odd side effects. Voice cracking at odd pitches. Fingers moving with a skill they had not learned. Those victims were former hosts. The threads had screenshots of receipts, of user reviews that read like product blurbs for conscience. Avery read and felt Jonah's cadence react in their chest. You always like the word curate. Jonah's echo said once in a voice that was both inside and not. You liked how it made the messy sound like art. You're not Jonah, Avery snapped, folding the napkin the way he had taught them to, quick and precise. Neither are you, the echo said. We are folds. It was a small quarrel that would become a long one. Jonah's echo had been altered in the marketplace, somewhere between the hospice and Avery's bedroom. Some curator's hybridization had introduced a note of impatience, a hair's breadth of aggression in the cadence Jonah used to say good morning. Avery could feel it when they laughed. It was like a burr under the tongue. The detective who would be the public face for the investigation was not a cop. She was an archivist of endings. Mira Klein, a true crime podcaster who spent her career telling stories of people who disappeared. People trusted podcasters. They trusted their logic of narrative. When the philanthropist's son, a man named Elias Voss, was arrested, it made a tidy story for listeners. Elias' defense. He had been implanted by a donor who confessed to cultish tendencies in private. The prosecution. Elias had purchased a devotion template from a curator and used it. The defense produced receipts. The prosecution produced donors' mitochondrial tags in the victim's neural tissue. The jury looked uneasy. Mira wanted a lead. She came to Avery for two reasons. They had been friends in a way that wasn't quite intimacy, and she knew how to turn cadence into narrative. Avery, who had left the microphone behind and taken to digging, had found something else, a ledger. It was accidental, as most discoveries are. A junior tech at a salvage clinic had forgotten to delete an old file system image. In a folder buried under a dozen named donors, a CSV had survived with purchase timestamps, anonymized user IDs, and a column that read blend_ratio. The ledger suggested composite echoes, percentage splits between donors. There were entries that paired patients with dominance at a 10-to-1 ratio. There were entries with high bids from corporations and low bids from lonely callers in the suburbs. There were entries that matched several victims' mitochondrial signatures to the same composite template. It threads like a loom, Mira said when Avery showed her the ledger. She had a habit of folding her hands in the shape of a podcast microphone when she thought. In 3 acts, supplier, algorithm, purchaser. But who's running it? Avery asked. Mira shrugged. Not one man, not one company. An emergent market without a face. They had proof, enough to shake committees, too abstract to convict. The ledger could be traced to nodes and shell accounts. There were clinics paid in crypto. There were offshore hosts. There was an ethics advisory with a board that had a strange number of hedge fund managers. Avery felt Jonah's echo argue like a dialect. It was small and human and infuriating. You should burn it, it said. Avery's hands folded the napkin again. They had done it automatically since Jonah's diagnosis. Fold, close a drawer, hum a tune. Their fingers remembered the tendon pathways the way birds remember migration. The echo's voice had the pattern of Jonah's impatience. Decisive, urgent. Burn what? Avery asked out loud, because the world had started to feel like a room they shared with someone who disagreed at the margins. Everything, the echo said. All the vials, the ledgers. Better to erase the comfort than to let market hands shape our last phrases into weapons. The thought was not new. Legislators had floated bills for eco-euthanasia. Mass deletions if the curator could not be stopped. There were grassroots activists calling for a cleansing of the banks. Some victims demanded eradication. They believed the only justice was to remove the possibility of future possession, even if it meant erasing their loved one's last words. Avery thought of Jonah's napkin in the drawer. They thought of the old woman on the forum who had sold her husband's lullaby to pay for surgery and wrote, months later, "It keeps my daughter awake at night," singing the wrong name. They thought of the murdered young man who had been found with flowers in his palm and a phrase in his brain he never learned. We don't get to decide for everyone, Mira said. If we burn the banks, we erase solace for those who wanted it. If we keep them, we let the market monetize grief. And you have a vote? Avery asked. Mira didn't answer. She had that look podcasters get when story folds into agency. Her jaw tightened. We expose the curator. We make the ledger public. People can decide with their eyes open. Let institutions, courts, regulators make the call, not private mobs. Regulators are slow, Avery said, and sometimes they take bribes. Then we start a new institution, Mira said, a third-party archive, consent-coded, decentralized. People can deposit echoes with audited wills attached. It was plausible in the way inventions are plausible when you are desperate for a bridge. It was also a lot of work. It was an answer that did not answer what to do about people already harmed. Avery lay awake with a napkin folded on their chest and Jonah's echo doing what it had always done, offering a different opinion like an aftertaste. It was not Jonah's voice alone. It was a chorus of him, of changes, of something the algorithm had mixed into him. The napkin was warm against the skin. They infiltrated a clinic because it was faster than waiting for subpoenas. Mira and Avery had acquired a rogue coder who could spin an avatar to a clinic's intercom system, a hacker who had lost a sister to possession. The clinic at dawn smelled the same as all clinics at dawn, warm disinfectant and coffee gone cold. They found a back room with shelves of vials lined like seed packets. Labels read like product copy, patience mid-volume, 2x resilience, charisma, adult male Midwest 0.8. Not all vials were labeled, many were barcoded. There were racks with donors' names written in permanent marker and a wall full of prints. Spectrograms, baseline EEG graphs, attractive visualizations. In the corner stood a rack with a little server hummed like a refrigerator. A blinking light indicated network activity. The server was a curator's local node. Avery held Jonah's napkin in a fist. It was ridiculous. It was sacred. It smelled faintly of coffee. They took photos with a phone and left fingerprints on the metal shelf where something had been moved. They left with traces of everything. A vial of warmth tucked into Myra's satchel, a spectrogram saved onto a thumb drive, an image of the server's login screen. It was all thin evidence and a sea of plausible deniability. But if you stitched enough threads together, they began to form a pattern like cloth. Mira played the audio back in her studio that night and cut the sounds into a narrative. She threaded the sounds into a single episode that was less about verdict than about method. People listened. They called. They posted. The ledger's existence could no longer be suppressed. The first wave of lawsuits came with it. The industry flailed. Clinics shuttered. Donor banks posted statements with weasel words. Regulators convened emergency sessions. And still, people offer their echoes for sale. Grief is a market, and markets are stubborn. Courtrooms produce an odd prose, thematics in the language of exhibits, shock and flatness of cross-examination. The prosecution managed to get enough evidence for a preliminary hearing. The ledger entries matched timestamp purchases from accounts linked to Voss philanthropic shells. There was testimony from clinicians who had noticed anomalous microsutures, muscle patterns artificially developed by iterative echo seeding. A neurologist testified, chewing an old pen with a nervous habit, that repeated imposition of attractor states could, over time, remodel peripheral musculature through reflexive learning and microtension. He called them epiphenomenal somatic signatures. The defense countered with experts who said the science was nascent and the evidence circumstantial. Correlation is not causation, they argued. We cannot calm a demand for taste in his mitochondria. Outside the courthouse, protesters carried napkins on sticks like flags. Some wore t-shirts that read "Save my last words." Others wore black and chanted for the bank's erasure. The city smelled of coffee and smoke. Avery's name was on a petition to shred the banks. Myra's podcast played the Ledger's CSV as if it were a confessional. The Ledger had become a moral Rorschach test. Avery kept Jonah's napkin in a drawer that no one could see. Jonah's cadence, now peppered with an odd hardness, often disagreed with Avery's choices. Sometimes it would disagree in small, helpful ways. Leave the roast, it's burned, and other times it would argue for burning the ledger. Their inner quarrel became public in small, ineffable ways. Misremembered dates that made listeners suspect Avery of leading evidence, a wrong inflection in a public reading that nearly got them fired. People told them not to host. They said, "You cannot be a detective and a vessel." Avery folded the napkin. They hummed Jonah's tune as if testing whether the cadence would go back to its original softness. It didn't. There were burrs of impatience. The curator had mixed in demand. The final hearing was to be a ruling on whether the curator, the emergent market, the algorithmic curator, could be treated as an actionable entity under commerce law. It was strange to think the court might label a set of code as something that could be enjoined. The last day in court, the prosecution produced something cold and human, a CSV with names of small donors alongside names of buyers who had requested blends for influence. It was an ugly ledger, full of the everyday needs that people had typed into the void. Help me speak at my daughter's wedding. Make me less afraid to fire him. The curator had optimized and monetized those wants. Avery sat in the gallery and felt Jonah's echo argue differently now. Soft, coaxing. Make the ledger public, but not destructive, it said. Create a way to vault the echoes with consent. Remove the curator's ability to touch them, but keep the words. People deserve that choice. They had seen the cruelty of destruction. They had seen donors' last gifts turned into weapons. But they had also read the posts of elderly men who had bought their wives' laughter back for a few months apiece. Who were they to erase solace? Myra's face at the defense table was stone. She was a believer in sunlight. Expose them, she had told Avery once. The sound of her voice like a tape being fast-forwarded. Let people choose. When the judge delivered the preliminary ruling, it was a slow thing. The court would not order a mass deletion of donor banks. It would, however, enjoin the curators trading algorithms, freeze transaction nodes, and appoint an independent curator, a civic archive with audited consent protocols, to receive donated echoes with explicit legal wills attached. Clinics would be compelled to register donors and secure offline custody if donors requested. Buyers would be forced to disclose their purchases on the public register for a period of 10 years. The ruling was, on paper, a little edict with teeth. It was also a compromise that would not please everyone. Outside the courthouse, protesters shouted both for and against the ruling. The city smelled of win and loss. Media anchors called it a victory for balanced policy. Podcasters called it cowardice. Avery folded the napkin twice and put it back in the drawer. They sat on the floor of their kitchen and let the echo talk. You could have burned it, Jonah's echo said. You chose committees, laws, slow things. Avery thought of the murdered and of the lullabies sold to pay medical bills. They thought of Jonah's laugh. They thought about the dead man with flowers in his palm, whose voice and hands had been touched by a blend. They thought of the ledger's lines, each a small human, want translated into currency. I couldn't do that, Avery said. I couldn't erase people's choices. You chose to preserve a system, the echo said. You chose to let the banks exist, but with new locks. I chose to give people a choice, Avery corrected. I chose to stop the curator from optimizing at scale. I chose to make it harder. The napkin lay between their knees. They smoothed it with thumb. And what about you? Jonah's echo asked. What about being mixed, sold, optimized? Avery did not answer for a long time. They thought of the spring Jonah loved, of the way he would hum the same tune when he was nervous, of the burr of impatience the curator had slipped into him. They thought of the idea of erasing Jonah's echo before someone else planted a blend in them that would make them do worse things. They opened the drawer and took the napkin out. It was worn where they had folded it. They unfolded it all the way and placed it on their palm like a small map. They remembered Jonah's last joke about vanilla for brain and how he had had a way of making the world seem like a room someone could stand in with you. I could burn it, they said finally. I could delete the copy I have and never again let someone hybridize it. The echo hummed a cadence like Jonah's laugh. If you kill your last word, you kill a solace for others. You deny the person you loved a voice to console someone years from now. And you, Avery asked, do you want to be edited for other people's wants? They both sat in that question until the kettle whistled and the rain eased. Then Avery did something that felt like a compromise or a betrayal, depending on who told the story later. They uploaded a full hash of Jonah's template to the civic archive the court had ordered, an encrypted deposit under Jonah's real name with a consent clause that forbade any trade or hybridization without a unanimous, notarized consent from a living set of designated descendants, a digital will that made future trading practically impossible. They saved a copy of the napkin spectrogram on an offline drive and gave it to Mira, who swore to keep it sealed until a council could decide Jonah's fate with sober minds. They shredded their own local copy. It was a small legal and mournful solution. It kept Jonah's last song alive in a way that required consent, not transaction fees. Why not keep one? Mira asked later, when they met at a diner, with an eggshell orange lamp, because the curator taught me how easy it is to sell everything. Avery said, I couldn't be sure I wouldn't wake up one day and find Jonah's cadence tuned to sell something I didn't want. You destroyed his voice? Mira asked, not unkindly, or you preserve it with chains? Avery picked at the edge of a napkin on the table. The orange lamp hummed. I locked it, they said. I put it in the grave with a legal pad. It's not gone. It's just not for sale. Mira laughed, a short, dry sound. That's more than most people get. Months later, the curator's nodes were still a hydra. New clusters rose in corners of the web where laws were thin. The market had changed shape. It learned to be stealthier. But the public vault remained, a small island where echoes could not be traded like commodities. It was bureaucratic and imperfect and, to many, righteous. Avery continued to host their show, though their voice carried new lines. Legal updates, interviews with donors who had regretted sales, pieces on consent law. Jonah's cadence sometimes came back like a ghost tide, smoothing a rough sentence or lending an old joke a wrong timing. It was most present when Avery folded napkins for charity drives, when they taught others how to fold roses with quiet fingers. They did it to remember. One night, Mira brought a file to Avery with the title of the curator, Redacted. It was a dump from a whistleblower, raw and messy. The first line read, Algorithmic curation is not a villain. It is a mirror. The file contained logs from a node saying, matched, buyer X requested decisiveness plus maternal warmth. Result, optimization success. There were private notes from clinics about microsuture techniques that enhance reflexive learning. Avery read it under the lamplight, the napkin on the table like a small altar. When they finished, they sat for a long time. Jonah's echo was quiet. You could delete the public vault. The echo said, you could burn the ledger. You could destroy the banks. Avery closed the file and set it back on the table. I could, they said, but I have the right to choose for everyone. And I don't trust people who would make the choice easy with fire. Aren't you tired? The echo asked. Tired is a weak word for the ache in Avery's bones. They'd spent months watching small lives get reoriented by other people's grief. They'd listened to donors who said they had been coerced. They had also listened to listeners who spoke of how a borrowed cadence had helped them speak at eulogies and hold a hand, and how their child had learned a lullaby once thought lost. There were names on both sides. The ledger was a cross-section of human want. Avery stood and unfolded the napkin and folded it again, crisp and clean. The folding was a small liturgy. The fold was a promise. I won't burn it, they said. I won't let the curator sell everything. But I won't erase the people who sought solace either. They sealed the file and uploaded it to a distributed archive with an access protocol. Researchers could access but not use. Donors could place future echoes in escrow with legal constraints. Buyers could register purchases, but heavy penalties and audits would make bulk trading near impossible. It was not annihilation. It was not a perfect fix. It was a hard, administrative scaffolding around an ache. When the appellate courts later debated the rights of templates, when a new statute was drafted, when clinics filed new consent protocols with long legal appendices, the story found no neat end. The curator's code muttered in corners of the web. New nodes opened, closed. The market learned. The ledger continued to leak like a slow faucet. People continued to buy solace in ways they would not soon confess. Avery kept the napkin folded in the drawer and sometimes took it out and smoothed the creases. When the cadence behind their teeth of bourbon patience returned, they would hum Jonah's tune and let it out like someone practicing speech in a new tongue. They learned to speak back. You could have saved yourself the trouble. Jonah's echo said once, softer than they'd heard it in months. Avery folded the napkin and slid it back into its dark drawer. Maybe, they said, but then I would have been someone who claimed to own other people's last words. I couldn't do that. They made coffee, boiled the kettle, listened to Myra's new episode, and answered a caller who said, voice shaking, Did you think we'd ever find a way to keep the comfort and stop the harm? Avery blinked at the kitchen window, where rain had started again. No, they said, but I think we can try to make a harder choice. To protect choice. The caller sobbed, and in the static between words, Jonah's echo hummed a cadence that was almost, but not quite, home. Avery let it be. They had made two promises that might tug against each other forever. One to preserve what was tender, and one to keep predators from learning how to turn that tenderness into a weapon. In the end, the curator remained a mirror. It showed people what they wanted to be and what they feared. The ledger stayed a ledger. The vault stayed a vault. The napkin stayed in the drawer. The city kept smelling like coffee and disinfectant, and sometimes, faintly, of vanilla for the brain. Avery taught a class on consent law and on whisper technologies in the public square. They read Jonah's laugh in the margins of their life and corrected it when it meant harm. They did not destroy the echoes. They did not let the curator keep them. They chose, clumsily and compassionately, to build a new kind of custody, legal, slow, and in a few stubborn places, lovingly human. The question of whether they had done enough, whether they had chosen rightly, lived on in the small, cold burn of a choice not wholly identical to a sacrifice. The napkin, folded twice, remembered Jonah. The world, messy and human, kept learning its way towards something like justice.